December 14th, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The frozen earth pressed against Frank Kowalski's cheek like the cold steel he'd known all his life in the mills. But this wasn't Pittsburgh. This was a crater 3 feet deep, filled with ice-crusted mud and the metallic stench of cordite. Above him, pine branches snapped under the weight of snow and shrapnel. His Springfield lay at an impossible angle. Not the textbook 45 degrees they drilled into him at Camp Perry, but nearly vertical, braced against a shattered tree stump. Through the scope, a German machine gun nest materialized in fragments. Felled growl wool, the dull glint of a belt feed mechanism, a sliver of exposed neck above a collar. Frank's breath formed small clouds that dissipated into the December air. His finger found the trigger. The manual said prone position. The manual said stable platform. The manual said a lot of things that meant nothing when you were pinned in a hole with your squad bleeding out 30 yards behind you. He fired. In the steel mills of Pittsburgh's North Side, Frank Kowalski had learned that the book was written by men who never stood where the sparks fell. For 12 years, from age 16 to 28, he'd worked the open hearth at Jones and Laughlin, where temperatures reached 3,000 degrees, and the rule book said to stand behind the protective barrier. But the metal didn't care about the rule book. It went where physics took it, and if you wanted to guide a pour without losing a limb, you learned to read angles the way other men read newspapers. When his draft notice arrived in March of 1943, Frank was making $112 a month. Good money for a man whose father had died in those same mills. His mother, Anna, didn't cry when he left. She learned that lesson when his father's body came home. She packed him a lunch of kielbasa sandwiches and said only, "The steel remembers everything. So should you." At Fort Benning, they taught him to shoot. He scored expert marksman on his third day. The range instructor, a Kentucky rifleman named Patterson, noticed something unusual. Frank's positions were never quite regulation. He'd cock his leg at odd angles, brace against his pack instead of going flat, shoot from crouches that looked unstable but somehow worked. When Patterson corrected him, Frank's scores dropped. When Patterson left him alone, he put 5 rounds through a 3-inch circle at 500 yards. "You shoot like you're working around something that isn't there," Patterson said. "I shoot like the shot needs to be taken," Frank replied. By November of 1944, Frank was with the 28th Infantry Division, pushing through the Hürtgen Forest in what would become one of the war's bloodiest campaigns. The forest was a green hell of ancient trees, where traditional warfare dissolved into something primordial. Mines hung from branches. Artillery turned centuries-old oaks into thousands of wooden daggers that fell like rain. Men disappeared into the fog and never came back. The 28th lost 600 men in the first 3 days. Frank's squad, 12 men from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, was down to 7 by the second week. They'd been trained for open-field combat, for the sweep across France they'd seen in the newsreels. Instead, they got a medieval forest where you couldn't see 20 yards, and every tree might hide death. That's when Frank started doing what the mills had taught him: improvising angles. The first time, it was desperation. His squad was pinned by a German sniper who'd killed 2 men in 15 minutes. The sniper was elevated, concealed, patient. Traditional counter-sniper doctrine said to flank, to use artillery, to wait for darkness. Frank looked at the terrain, a slope, several fallen logs, a depression in the earth, and saw something else. He saw the geometry of a steel pour, where the metal follows gravity and momentum, where position matters more than power. He crawled backward, not forward, found a fallen tree at a 40-degree angle, climbed it like a ladder, Springfield slung across his back. 10 feet up, he wedged himself into a fork of branches, his body twisted at an angle that would have earned him a reprimand on any firing range in America. But from here, he had a sight line the German sniper hadn't considered. The man was protected from ground level, from the conventional approaches. He wasn't protected from above and behind at an angle no manual suggested. Frank's shot took him through the shoulder blade. Not a kill shot. Frank never knew if the man lived, but the firing stopped. His squad advanced. They took 3 more casualties that day, but they took the ridge. Sergeant Halloran, a Boston Irishman who'd fought in North Africa, pulled Frank aside that evening. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" "J&L Steel." Furnace number 7. Halloran stared at him. Then he laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The army's going to love you or court-martial you? Maybe both. Over the next 3 weeks, Frank developed what would later be called, though never officially, the Kowalski method. He shot from ditches with his rifle inverted. He climbed trees and fired one-handed while holding branches. He used rubble piles, destroyed vehicles, even dead horses as improvised platforms. His positions looked absurd, violated every principle of marksmanship stability, and worked with terrifying consistency. The key was understanding that stability wasn't about rigidity. In the mills, Frank had learned that a rigid structure shatters under stress. What you needed was dynamic tension, multiple points of contact, each one weak, but together creating a momentary equilibrium. A knee against a rock, an elbow in mud, a rifle butt pressed against a tree root. For 3 seconds, the time it took to acquire, aim, and fire, it was enough. His squad started surviving at rates that defied the forest's statistics. Word spread. Men from other platoons asked to be assigned with Kowalski. Officers who would have reprimanded him for his unorthodox methods kept quiet because his methods kept their men alive. By December, Frank had 17 confirmed kills, and perhaps twice that many unconfirmed. He never kept count. The numbers felt like hubris, like tempting whatever God decided who walked out of the Hürtgen and who stayed there forever. The machine gun nest was supposed to be suppressed. Intelligence said the Germans were falling back, that this sector was nearly clear. Intelligence was wrong. Frank's squad walked into an ambush that killed 3 men in the first burst of fire. The survivors scattered into whatever cover they could find. Frank ended up in the crater, separated, with a sight line on the nest, but no support. He took the shot from his impossible angle. The machine gun stopped. He thought he'd won. Then he heard the voices, German, close, moving through the trees with the confidence of men who own this ground. He'd been so focused on the nest that he hadn't seen the patrol. 8 men, maybe 10, fanning out. They'd heard his shot. They were coming. Frank had 4 rounds left. He could take maybe 2 of them before they overwhelmed him. The math was simple and final. He thought about his mother's kielbasa sandwiches, about the heat of furnace number 7, about a girl named Dorothy who'd promised to wait. He thought about all of this in the 3 seconds it took for the first German soldier to appear at the crater's edge. The man was young, maybe 20, with frost in his eyebrows and a Mauser that looked too big for his thin frame. They stared at each other. Frank's rifle was still wedged against the tree stump, impossible to swing around quickly. The German's Mauser was pointed at Frank's chest. "Amerikaner," the young soldier said. Not a question. Frank raised his hands. What followed was a blur of pain and incomprehension. They stripped him of weapons, of his ammunition, of the small compass he'd carried from Pittsburgh. They marched him. He was the only survivor they'd found, deeper into the forest, toward the German rear lines. He walked for what might have been 2 hours or 6, time collapsing into the rhythm of boots on frozen earth. The explosion, when it came, was American. A delayed artillery barrage, the kind the 28th called down when they weren't sure if their own men had cleared an area. Frank felt himself lifted, turned sideways in the air, slammed back down. His left leg erupted in a flower of pain that had colors, red, then white, then a purple so deep it approached black. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard German voices shouting, felt hands on him, rough but not cruel. Someone was pressing something against his leg. He looked down, a mistake, and saw his thigh torn open, the femur visible through the meat, blood pumping in rhythm with his heartbeat. He'd seen injuries like this in the mills. Men with these injuries died. He waited to die. Instead, they carried him. Frank woke in a place that made no sense. Clean white walls, the smell of disinfectant cutting through the usual stench of mud and cordite. A German medical officer, middle-aged, with glasses that caught the light from an overhead bulb, stood beside what appeared to be a surgical table. Frank was on it. "You are awake," the doctor said in accented but clear English. "This is good. I need to tell you what I am doing. You understand?" Frank tried to speak. His throat was raw. He managed. "Prisoner." "Yes, also patient. I am Hauptmann Dietrich, Medical Corps. Your leg is very badly damaged. Without surgery, you will die from bleeding or infection within 24 hours, perhaps less. I am going to operate now. We have some morphine, not much. It will hurt. Do you understand? Frank understood nothing. He'd been taught that German field hospitals were places where wounded Americans died of neglect, where medical care was reserved for German soldiers, where a prisoner might wait days for treatment while infection turned his wounds gangrenous. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. Why? He managed. Hauptmann Dietrich adjusted his glasses. Because I am a doctor, because you are 28 years old, I found your tags, and you should not die in a forest in December. Because perhaps if I save you, someday an American doctor will save a German boy. Or perhaps not. Perhaps I am simply tired of choosing who lives and who dies based on which uniform they wear. He paused. Also, you killed Obergefreiter Muller. He was a very good machine gunner, but not a good man. You did the world a favor. The surgery took 3 hours. Frank remained conscious for most of it, held down by 2 orderlies while Hauptmann Dietrich worked with instruments that looked medieval and hands that moved with unexpected gentleness. The doctor talked throughout, describing what he was doing in a calm, almost conversational tone. Removing shrapnel, debriding dead tissue, clamping blood vessels, setting the bone with 2 metal pins salvaged from God knows where. You will walk again, Dietrich said, though perhaps with a limp. The bone will heal if infection does not take it. I am giving you our last sulfa powder. This is optimism on my part, or perhaps stupidity. We will see which. When it was over, when Frank lay on a cot in a ward with 6 German soldiers, who stared at him with exhaustion too deep for hostility, he asked the question that had been building in his morphine-addled mind. No line. Line. Dietrich looked puzzled. Waiting. I should have. Others first. Understanding dawned in the doctor's eyes. Ah, you expected triage. To wait while we treated our own. He sat on the edge of Frank's cot, a gesture so casual it seemed to violate every rule of war. Mr. Kowalski, I read your tags. I have been a surgeon for 22 years. I learned my profession at Charité in Berlin. I took an oath. That oath did not include a clause about nationality. He gestured at the other patients. These men waited. You did not. You know why? Frank shook his head. Because your injury was worse. Because you would die first. That is the only triage that matters to me now. I am too old and too tired to be a National Socialist. I am simply a doctor in a forest where too many boys are dying. Frank spent 6 days in that field hospital before American forces retook the sector. He learned that Hauptmann Dietrich had been a university professor before the war, that he'd voted against Hitler in 1933, that he had a son Frank's age fighting somewhere in Russia. He learned that the young soldier who'd captured him was named Klaus, that he was from Bavaria, that he'd been drafted and hated the war with a fervor Frank recognized from other reluctant soldiers. He learned that the German soldiers in the war treated him with a mixture of curiosity and a weary camaraderie that transcended language. They shared cigarettes, American ones, captured, and spoke in broken English about their families, their fears, their desire for the war to end. One of them, a corporal named Werner who'd lost his right hand to a grenade, taught Frank a card game played with German cards Frank didn't understand. They played anyway, using gestures and laughter that needed no translation. When the Americans came, when the ward was overrun by men from the 82nd Airborne who cleared the building with weapons raised, Frank tried to explain that these Germans had saved him, that Hauptmann Dietrich had operated without hesitation, that they treated him not as an enemy, but as a human being who needed help. The captain who took his report listened with the polite skepticism of a man who'd heard too many improbable stories. We'll note it in your file, Corporal, but you understand these are enemy combatants. We'll process them as POWs. The doctor, Frank insisted, he used their last medicine on me. We'll note it, the captain repeated. Hauptmann Dietrich was led away with the others, hands bound, face impassive. As he passed Frank's cot, he paused. Walk well, Mr. Kowalski. Try not to get shot again. I will not be there to repair you. Frank never saw him again. After the war, he tried to find him, wrote letters to the Red Cross, to the occupation authorities, to anyone who might have records. He learned only that Dietrich had survived the war, had returned to Berlin, had died in 1951. Of what, the records didn't say. Frank imagined it was exhaustion. 22 years of saving lives, of making impossible choices, of being too tired to be anything but a doctor. Frank returned to active duty in March of 1945, walking with the predicted limp, carrying metal pins in his femur that would set off airport detectors for the rest of his life. The war in Europe ended 2 months later. He never fired another shot in combat, but his technique, the Kowalski method, as it came to be known, spread through the army like rumors always spread among soldiers. Men who'd served with him taught it to others. Officers who'd seen it work began quietly suggesting that rigid adherence to manual positions might not be the only path to effective marksmanship. By Korea, informal training in adaptive positioning had become standard in some sniper units. By Vietnam, elements of it were being taught at Fort Benning, though rarely with attribution. The official recognition was minimal. Frank received a Bronze Star for his actions in the Hürtgen Forest, for valor in combat against enemy forces, presented in a ceremony with 11 other recipients. There was no mention of his unorthodox methods, no acknowledgement that he'd probably saved 40 or 50 lives through sheer refusal to follow doctrine. The citation praised his exemplary marksmanship and dedication to duty. It said nothing about improvisation, about seeing angles others missed, about bringing the logic of Pittsburgh steel mills to German forests. Frank didn't mind. Recognition had never been the point. Survival was the point. Getting his men home was the point. Everything else was just noise. He returned to Pittsburgh in August of 1945. Dorothy had waited. They married in October in the same church where his parents had married 30 years earlier. He went back to Jones and Laughlin to furnace number 7, to the heat and the metal and the angles that made sense. He never talked about the war, not to Dorothy, not to the 3 children they'd have, not to the co-workers who knew he'd served but knew better than to ask. The only time he spoke of it was in 1968, when his eldest son, Frank Jr., came home from basic training and mentioned that his marksmanship instructor had taught them something called adaptive positioning. "It's unofficial," Frank Jr. said, "but Sergeant Davis says it's been around since World War II. Said some guy in the 28th Infantry figured it out in the Hürtgen Forest." Frank Sr. was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The forest taught a lot of men a lot of things. Most of them dead now." "You were there, Dad. Hürtgen Forest." "Yes." "Did you know him? The guy who figured it out?" Frank looked at his son, 19 years old, wearing the same uniform Frank had worn, preparing to go to a different war in a different forest. He thought about Hauptmann Dietrich, about Klaus from Bavaria, about Werner and his missing hand. He thought about all the rules he'd broken and all the lives that breaking those rules had saved. "I knew him," Frank said finally. "He was just a steel worker trying not to die. Nothing special. Sergeant Davis says he changed how the Army thinks about marksmanship. Then Sergeant Davis gives him too much credit. The Army doesn't change. It just forgets and relearns the same lessons every 20 years. Frank Jr. left for Vietnam in 1969. He came back in 1971, walking with a limp of his own, carrying his own silences. They never discussed those silences. Some things Frank Sr. understood couldn't be taught. They had to be survived. Frank Kowalski died at 78, in a hospital bed with his grandchildren around him. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was 4 paragraphs long. Steelworker, veteran, survived by wife Dorothy, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. There was a line about his Bronze Star. Nothing about the Hürtgen Forest, nothing about unorthodox methods or saved lives or German doctors who'd kept their oaths in circumstances that made oath-keeping nearly impossible. At the funeral, a man in his 70s approached Dorothy. He'd been in Frank's squad, he said. He'd survived because Frank had shot from impossible positions, had refused to accept that death was inevitable just because the manual said so. "He never talked about it," Dorothy said. "No," the man agreed. "None of us did. But we thought about it. Every day we lived that we shouldn't have lived, we thought about it." In the years after Frank's death, military historians began researching the evolution of American sniper doctrine. Some of them found references to the Kowalski method, though it was rarely called that officially. Some of them found the after-action reports from the Hürtgen Forest, the casualty statistics that showed Frank's squad surviving at impossible rates. Some of them pieced together the story of a steelworker who'd brought the logic of molten metal to frozen forests, who'd understood that adaptation mattered more than orthodoxy, that survival required seeing what the manual couldn't imagine. But most of this research remained in military archives, unpublished, classified not from secrecy, but from indifference. Frank Kowalski's contribution to American military doctrine was real but unofficial, acknowledged in training sessions and field manuals without attribution, taught to thousands of soldiers who never knew they were learning from a Pittsburgh mill worker who'd simply refused to die according to regulation. And perhaps that was fitting. Frank had never wanted recognition. He'd wanted to go home, to return to the heat and the steel and the angles that made sense. He'd wanted to build a life, to raise children, to work honest work and sleep without dreaming of frozen forests. Whether he succeeded, whether any of them succeeded, those men who came home from wars carrying silences, is a question without easy answers. What is certain is that Frank Kowalski lived 67 years, 7 months, and 14 days longer than he should have. That his unorthodox angles saved perhaps 50 lives. That somewhere in the mathematics of survival and sacrifice, in the space between regulation and improvisation, his refusal to accept the manual's limitations changed how America trained its soldiers for generations. And that once, in a German field hospital in a forest in December, a doctor who was too tired to be anything but a doctor had kept his oath and saved a steelworker's life for no better reason than that it was the right thing to do. Some rules, it turns out, are worth breaking, and some are worth keeping, regardless of uniforms or flags or the 1,000 ways men find to kill each other in December forests. The steel remembers everything. So should we.